A photograph from 1860 seems ordinary, until historians notice the enslaved woman's smile. The photography archive at Duke University housed thousands of daguerreotypes and early paper photographs from the antebellum South. Dr. Lauren Mitchell had spent 3 years cataloging them, documenting the faces of plantation owners, merchants, and politicians who had built their wealth on the labor of enslaved people. Most of the images were predictable. Stiff white families posed in their finest clothing, projecting wealth and respectability. Enslaved people, when they appeared at all, were positioned as props, standing rigidly in the background, faces carefully neutral, their humanity reduced to decoration in someone else's portrait. But one photograph stopped Lauren cold. The image was dated 1860, taken in South Carolina according to the notation on its mount. The Whitmore family, Riverside Plantation, April 1860. It showed a family of 5 posed in front of a grand columned house. The father, perhaps 50 years old, sat in an ornate chair, his hand resting on a cane. His wife stood beside him, her face stern beneath an elaborate bonnet. 3 adult children, 2 sons and a daughter, all appearing to be in their 20s, stood around their parents in formal arrangement. It was a typical portrait of Southern aristocracy, except for one detail that made Lauren's breath catch. In the background, standing near the house's entrance, was an enslaved woman. She appeared to be in her 30s, wearing the plain dress typical of house servants. But, unlike every other enslaved person Lauren had seen in hundreds of similar photographs, this woman was smiling. Not the forced, uncomfortable smile of someone ordered to appear pleasant. This was something else entirely. A knowing smile, almost secretive, as if the woman possessed knowledge that made her genuinely deeply satisfied. Lauren zoomed in on her computer screen, enhancing the woman's face. The smile was unmistakable. Her eyes held something that looked remarkably like triumph. It was wrong. Everything about it violated the visual language of antebellum photography, where enslaved people were meant to be invisible, passive, or at most, placidly content. This woman looked like she knew a secret, and she looked pleased about it. Lauren pulled up the archive's database, searching for any additional information about the Whitmore family. The entry was sparse. Prominent South Carolina family, owners of Riverside Plantation, photograph donated in 1932 by estate of Margaret Whitmore Clayton. She expanded her search to historical records outside the archive. The Whitmore name appeared in several digitized South Carolina newspapers from 1860, and what she found made her sit back in her chair, her heart racing. The headline from the Charleston Mercury dated May 3rd, 1860, Tragedy at Riverside Plantation, Entire Whitmore family found dead. Lauren read the article with growing fascination and horror. James Whitmore, his wife Elizabeth, and their 3 adult children, Margaret, James Jr., and Robert, had all died within hours of each other on May 1st, 1860. The family physician had attributed the deaths to acute digestive distress, possibly from contaminated food. The photograph was dated April 1860, less than a month before the entire family died. Lauren looked back at the image, at the enslaved woman's enigmatic smile, a smile that suddenly seemed less mysterious and far more deliberate. She reached for her phone, pulling up the contact for Dr. Raymond Chen, a colleague who specialized in antebellum crime and justice systems. This wasn't just an unusual photograph anymore. This might be evidence of one of history's most perfectly executed acts of resistance. And that smile, that knowing, satisfied smile, might be the only testimony that survived. Raymond arrived at Duke's archive the next morning, his enthusiasm barely contained. He was a forensic historian who had spent a decade researching crimes in the antebellum South, particularly cases involving enslaved people. As Lauren showed him the photograph and the newspaper article, his expression shifted from curiosity to intense focus. Acute digestive distress, he read aloud. That's 19th century code for poisoning when doctors either couldn't identify it or chose not to investigate too closely. He looked at the photograph again, studying the woman's face. And you said this was taken less than a month before they died? Lauren nodded. April 1860. The newspaper reports their deaths on May 1st, all 5 family members dead within hours of each other. Raymond pulled up additional newspaper archives on his laptop. Let me see what else was reported. He searched through digitized South Carolina papers, finding several follow-up articles about the Whitmore deaths. One article from May 5th, 1860, provided more details. The tragic deaths of the Whitmore family have left the community in shock. All 5 members complained of severe stomach pains and vomiting after the evening meal on April 30th. Despite the physician's best efforts, all had expired by the morning of May 1st. Authorities have ruled the deaths accidental, likely due to spoiled meat or contaminated water. Authorities have ruled the deaths accidental, Raymond repeated, his tone skeptical. Which means they chose not to investigate further. In 1860, South Carolina, if a white family died under suspicious circumstances, there would typically be an extensive investigation, unless the alternative was too uncomfortable to contemplate. You mean if it implicated an enslaved person? Lauren said. Exactly. Acknowledging that an enslaved person had successfully poisoned an entire white family would have been terrifying to the white population. It would suggest that enslaved people had power, agency, the ability to strike back. Much easier to declare it an accident and move on. Lauren pulled up the photograph again, enlarging the woman's face. So this smile, she knew. She knew they were already poisoned when this photograph was taken. Raymond leaned closer to the screen. It's possible. Many poisons work slowly. If she'd been administering something over time, building up toxicity in their systems, they might have been asymptomatic when this photograph was taken but already condemned. He paused. She would have known. And this smile, this is her documentation, her testimony. They spent the next hour searching for more information about the Whitmore family and their plantation. Property records showed that Riverside Plantation encompassed over 800 acres and enslaved approximately 40 people. James Whitmore had inherited it from his father and expanded the operation significantly in the 1850s. Raymond found several court records mentioning the plantation, mostly routine business matters, property disputes with neighbors, and slave sale documents. But one entry stood out, a Charleston newspaper notice from 1858. Listen to this, Raymond said. It's a runaway slave advertisement. Absconded from Riverside Plantation, Negro woman named Celia, approximately 30 years of age, skilled in cooking and household duties. $50 reward for return. Warning, woman is considered dangerous and should be approached with caution. Lauren felt a chill. Celia, could that be her? She pointed to the woman in the photograph. The age matches. And skilled in cooking? That's significant. If she prepared the family's food, she would have had access and opportunity. Raymond made notes. The ad says she ran away in 1858. But if she was back at the plantation by 1860, either recaptured or she returned, and if she was the same woman in this photograph, then she had 2 years to plan her revenge, Lauren finished. 2 years to acquire poison, to understand how to administer it, to wait for the perfect moment. Raymond pulled up another document, a notice of estate sale from June 1860. After the Whitmore family died, the plantation and all its assets were sold to settle debts, including, he scrolled down the itemized list, including 42 Negro slaves, various ages and skills. Lauren felt sick. She killed them, and then she was sold anyway. Her act of resistance, her revenge, it didn't free her. No, Raymond agreed quietly. It didn't free her, but it did eliminate the specific people who had harmed her, and she made sure to document it. He looked at the photograph again. That smile isn't about freedom. It's about justice. Her justice. Finding records of enslaved people was always difficult. They were treated as property in legal documents, often listed only by first names, or not recorded at all. But Raymond had decades of experience navigating these fragmentary archives, and he was determined to find out what had happened to Celia after the Whitmore family's death. The estate sale document from June 1860 listed enslaved people by approximate age, gender, and skills, but no names. Female age 32, skilled cook and house servant, sold to Thomas Bradford $900, one entry read. The age matched Celia's description from the runaway advertisement. Raymond traced Thomas Bradford through property records. He owned a smaller plantation about 30 miles from Riverside, with holdings in Charleston. Bradford appeared in several business documents and social registers, another wealthy white Southerner who built his comfort on enslaved labor. But Bradford's records stopped abruptly in 1862. Raymond found a brief obituary. Thomas Bradford, age 47, died suddenly at his Charleston residence. He is survived by his wife Catherine and 2 daughters. Died suddenly, Lauren noted. That's interesting timing. Just 2 years after he purchased a woman who had already poisoned one family. Raymond's expression was grim. Well, I thought the same thing. Let me see if I can find more details about his death. He searched through Charleston newspapers from 1862. The obituary had been deliberately vague, but a small article from a few days later provided more context. The unexpected death of Mr. Thomas Bradford has been attributed to acute illness. His household staff reported that Mr. Bradford complained of severe abdominal pain and expired within hours. Physicians could not determine the precise cause. Lauren and Raymond looked at each other. The pattern was unmistakable. She did it again, Lauren said quietly. Celia killed Thomas Bradford too. If it was Celia, Raymond cautioned. We can't be certain without more evidence, but the circumstances are remarkably similar. They continued searching, trying to trace what happened to Bradford's enslaved people after his death. The records were even sparser than before. The Civil War was beginning, and documentation became chaotic as the South descended into conflict. But in the records of Union occupation forces in Charleston, Raymond found something significant. A list of formerly enslaved people who had been freed by Union troops in 1865 included a notation. Celia, approximately 37 years of age, formerly property of Catherine Bradford, claims free status, granted papers. She survived, Lauren breathed. She lived to see emancipation. Raymond pulled up additional records from the Freedmen's Bureau, established after the Civil War, to assist formerly enslaved people. And there, in a list of people seeking to locate family members separated by slavery, was another entry. Celia Johnson, age approximately 40, seeking information about daughter Ruth, sold away from Riverside Plantation, South Carolina in 1858. Lauren felt tears burning her eyes. That's why she ran away in 1858. They sold her daughter. Raymond nodded slowly. And when she was recaptured or returned, Probably because she had nowhere else to go, no way to survive alone, she decided that if she couldn't save her daughter, she could at least make the Whitmores pay for taking her. The pieces were falling into place. Celia had lost her daughter to slave sale, one of the cruelest aspects of slavery, the deliberate separation of families for profit. She had tried to escape, failed, and been returned to the plantation where her child had been stolen from her. And then she had taken her revenge. Methodically, patiently, she had poisoned the entire Whitmore family, and she had smiled for the camera, knowing that her justice was already served, that the photograph would capture her moment of triumph for posterity. "We need to find out if she ever located her daughter," Lauren said. "And we need to document Celia's full story. She was erased from history, just another nameless enslaved person, but she took power in the only way available to her. She fought back." Raymond was already searching through Freedmen's Bureau records, looking for any mention of Ruth. If Celia found her daughter after the war, there might be documentation, family reunification records, settlement information, anything that shows what happened to them after emancipation. The search would take time. But both historians understood that this was no longer just about an unusual photograph. This was about recovering the story of a woman who had been victimized, who had lost everything, and who had refused to remain powerless. Celia had smiled for that photograph in 1860. And now, more than 160 years later, historians were finally ready to understand what that smile meant. While Raymond continued searching for records of Celia's daughter, Lauren focused on understanding the mechanics of the poisoning itself. If Celia had successfully killed 5 people simultaneously, she must have used a specific poison and administered it in a calculated way that wouldn't immediately arouse suspicion. Lauren contacted Dr. Helen Martinez, a toxicologist at the University of North Carolina who specialized in historical poisonings. She sent Helen the newspaper descriptions of the Whitmore family's symptoms: severe stomach pains, vomiting, rapid onset, death within hours. Helen's response came the next day. Based on the symptoms and the timeline, the most likely poison would be arsenic. It was readily available in the 1860s, used in rat poison, insecticides, and even in some medicines. A skilled cook would have access to it, and it could be administered in food without detection if done carefully. Arsenic. Lauren researched its history and discovered that it had been called inheritance powder in earlier centuries, because it was so frequently used to murder family members for money or property. In the antebellum South, arsenic was common enough that acquiring it wouldn't necessarily raise suspicion, but Helen's follow-up email provided even more significant information. If this was arsenic poisoning, and if the family was buried rather than cremated, there might still be forensic evidence. Arsenic preserves remains. It essentially mummifies the body. If you could locate the Whitmore family graves and get permission for exhumation and testing, modern forensic analysis could definitively prove poisoning. Lauren immediately shared this with Raymond. If we could prove they were poisoned, Celia's story becomes irrefutable, not just speculation, but documented fact. Raymond pulled up property records for Riverside Plantation. The plantation was sold after the family's death, but there should be a family cemetery on the property. Most plantations had them. Let me see if I can find the current property owner. The land that had been Riverside Plantation was now divided among several owners. The original plantation house was gone, demolished in the 1920s. But the family cemetery, according to county records, remained on a 2-acre parcel that was now part of a private residence. Raymond contacted the property owner, a retired teacher named Margaret Ellis, who had purchased the land 15 years earlier. He explained their research carefully, emphasizing the historical significance without initially mentioning the poisoning. Margaret was fascinated. "I knew there was a cemetery on the property. There are 6 marked graves, all from the 1860s. I've kept it maintained, but I never researched who was buried there. If this is the Whitmore family, and if there's a story worth telling, I'm willing to discuss exhumation." 2 weeks later, Lauren and Raymond met with Margaret at the property. The cemetery was small, enclosed by a deteriorating wrought iron fence shaded by old oak trees. 6 headstones stood in a neat row, weathered but still legible. James Whitmore, Elizabeth Whitmore, Margaret Whitmore, James Whitmore Jr., Robert Whitmore, and one smaller stone that simply read, Infant Whitmore, 1842. "Nice. All 5 who died in 1860 are here," Raymond noted, plus a child who died earlier. Lauren photographed the graves, documenting their condition. "If we're going to request exhumation, we need to make a strong case to the county. We'll need to show historical significance and research value." Over the following month, they compiled a comprehensive proposal. The unusual photograph with Celia's smile, the newspaper reports of the mysterious deaths, the pattern suggesting poisoning, and the historical importance of documenting resistance by enslaved people. They submitted the request to the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, along with support letters from Duke University and the University of North Carolina. The approval came 3 months later with conditions. Only 1 grave would be exhumated initially. All work would be conducted by licensed forensic archaeologists, and any remains would be treated with appropriate respect and reinterred after analysis. The team chose to exhume James Whitmore, the family patriarch, reasoning that, as the plantation owner, he would have been the primary target of Celia's revenge. The exhumation took place on a gray morning in November. "Doctor?" Sarah Kim, the same forensic archaeologist who had worked on the Sarah Freeman case, led the team. Lauren and Raymond watched as the grave was carefully opened, revealing a remarkably preserved coffin. When the coffin was opened, Dr. Kim's assessment was immediate. Unusual preservation. The body is partially mummified, which is consistent with arsenic poisoning. She took tissue samples from multiple sites, bone, hair, and soft tissue that had been preserved by the poison itself. The samples were sent to 3 different laboratories for independent analysis. All 3 came back with the same result. James Whitmore's remains contained arsenic levels more than 200 times higher than natural occurrence. The levels were consistent with intentional, lethal poisoning. Lauren held the lab report in her hands, staring at the definitive proof. Celia did it. She really did poison them. And that smile in the photograph? She knew. She knew they were already dying. Raymond looked at the photograph on his laptop, at Celia's enigmatic expression. She took the only power she had, and she made sure to document it, to leave evidence so that someday someone would know that she fought back. But the question remained, what had happened to Celia after the war? Had she found her daughter? Had she lived to see freedom, or had her own story ended in tragedy? They needed to continue searching. Celia deserved to have her full story told. With definitive proof of the poisoning, Lauren and Raymond's research gained official support from Duke University and several historical societies. The story was attracting attention, not just academically, but publicly. News outlets began covering it. Enslaved woman's revenge revealed in 1860 photograph. News. But for Lauren and Raymond, the most important question remained unanswered. What had happened to Celia's daughter, Ruth? Raymond had been searching through Freedmen's Bureau records systematically, looking for any mention of Ruth in connection with Celia's 1865 request for information. The records were fragmented. Many had been lost or damaged over time, but he finally found a match in a file from Georgia. A notation from 1866. Ruth, approximately age 15, formerly enslaved in Georgia, seeking mother Celia, last seen South Carolina 1858. The entry included a brief description. House servant, literate, secret education, bearing scar on left arm from punishment. She was looking for her mother, too, Lauren said, reading over Raymond's shoulder. They were both searching for each other after the war. The next entry in the file, dated 3 months later, was even more significant. Ruth Johnson reunited with mother Celia Johnson in Charleston, SC. Family recorded for assistance program. Lauren felt tears spilling down her cheeks. They found each other. After everything Celia went through, after all that loss and violence and revenge, she found her daughter. Raymond was already searching for more records. If Celia and Ruth had been recorded in Charleston after the war, there might be additional documentation, census records, property deeds, church registries, anything that would tell them what happened next. The 1870 census provided their next breakthrough. In Charleston's Ward 4, a household was listed. Celia Johnson, age 45, Negro, occupation, laundress. Ruth Johnson, age 19, Negro, occupation, teacher. Ruth became a teacher, Lauren said. After being enslaved, after being separated from her mother for 8 years, she became a teacher. They found Ruth's name in records from the Charleston Colored School, established by formerly enslaved people and northern missionaries to educate black children. Ruth had taught there from 1868 to 1872, according to school records preserved by the Avery Research Center. And in a collection of letters at the center, they found something extraordinary. A letter written by Ruth Johnson in 1871, addressed to a northern charitable organization that supported black schools. Lauren read it aloud, her voice shaking. I write to thank you for your continued support of our school. As one who was denied education during bondage, who learned to read in secret at great risk, I understand the transformative power of knowledge. My mother, who suffered much under slavery and who fought in her own way for dignity and justice, has always told me that education is freedom. We are teaching our children not just letters and numbers, but the truth of their own worth and power. Raymond sat back, absorbing the significance. Ruth knew. Celia told her daughter what she had done. Fought in her own way for dignity and justice, Lauren repeated. That's not casual language. Ruth is acknowledging that her mother resisted, that she fought back. She knows about the poisoning. They continued searching and found more documentation of the Johnson family. Celia worked as a laundress in Charleston until her death in 1878, at approximately age 53. Her death certificate listed the cause as consumption, tuberculosis, the disease that killed so many in the crowded, impoverished conditions of post-war Charleston. Ruth continued teaching until 1875, when she married a carpenter named Samuel Porter. They had 4 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. Ruth lived until 1912, and her obituary in a black Charleston newspaper described her as a pillar of the community, an educator who dedicated her life to uplifting her race, and a woman who carried the strength of her ancestors. Lauren and Raymond traced Ruth's descendants and discovered that some still lived in South Carolina. One of them, Dr. James Porter, was a retired physician in Columbia. Raymond contacted him, explaining their research carefully. Dr. Porter's response was immediate and emotional. I've heard family stories about Celia all my life. My grandmother, Ruth's daughter, used to tell us that our great-great-grandmother was a woman of fierce courage. that she'd stood up to those who enslaved her in ways that we couldn't speak about openly. But we never had details, never had proof. If you found evidence of what she did, if you can tell her story properly, my family wants to be part of that. A week later, Lauren and Raymond met with Dr. Porter and several other descendants at his home in Columbia. Lauren brought the photograph, now professionally restored and enlarged, showing Celia's enigmatic smile with perfect clarity. The descendants gathered around it in silence. One woman, Dr. Porter's cousin Sharon, began to cry. "That's her! That's the woman who saved her daughter, who survived everything they did to her, who fought back when she had nothing left to lose." Dr. Porter spoke quietly. "My grandmother told me that Celia said she smiled that day because she knew her daughter would be avenged, that every moment of suffering the Whitmores experienced as they died was justice for Ruth being torn away from her. She said Celia never regretted it, never felt guilt, only satisfaction that she had taken back some measure of power." The family looked at the photograph, at Celia's knowing smile, at the white family posed so proudly, unaware they were already condemned. "Tell her story," Dr. Porter said to Lauren and Raymond. "Tell it honestly. Don't sanitize it. Don't apologize for it. Celia did what she had to do to survive and to achieve justice in a world that gave her no other options. That smile is her testimony, and we're proud of her." With the full support of Celia's descendants, Lauren and Raymond began compiling a comprehensive historical record. They wanted to tell not just the story of the poisoning, but the broader context, the violence of slavery, the separation of families, the impossible choices enslaved people faced, and the various forms of resistance they employed. Lauren contacted several museums and historical societies, proposing an exhibition centered on the photograph and Celia's story. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. The Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture expressed strong interest, as did the Charleston Museum and several academic institutions. But as they prepared the exhibition materials, they faced difficult questions about how to present the story. Should they explicitly state that Celia murdered 5 people? How would the public react to celebrating an act that was, by legal definition, mass murder? Raymond convened a panel of historians, ethicists, and descendants to discuss these questions. The conversation was intense and nuanced. Dr. Porter spoke first. "My ancestor killed 5 people. That's a fact. But those 5 people held her and her daughter in bondage. They claimed ownership of human beings. They destroyed families for profit. The law protected them and criminalized her very existence as a free person. So when we talk about murder, we need to ask, what do we call what they did to her? What do we call the violence of slavery itself?" A historian from the Avery Research Center added, "For too long, we've told the history of slavery from the perspective of white comfort. We emphasize enslaved people who resisted nonviolently, who waited patiently for emancipation, who fit into a narrative that doesn't threaten contemporary white audiences. But the reality is that enslaved people used whatever means were available to them, including violence, to resist their oppression. Celia's story is uncomfortable because it forces us to confront the moral complexity of resistance under extreme oppression." Lauren spoke carefully. "I think we need to present the facts honestly and let viewers grapple with the implications. We show the photograph with Celia's smile. We document the sale of her daughter. We present the evidence of poisoning. We trace what happened to Celia and Ruth after the war. And we let people draw their own conclusions about justice, resistance, and the morality of violence in the face of violence." The exhibition, titled "The Smile That Haunts: Celia's Story and the Resistance of the Enslaved," opened at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., 18 months after Lauren had first noticed the photograph. The centerpiece was the original 1860 photograph, dramatically enlarged and lit, with Celia's face at the center. Beside it was the forensic evidence of arsenic poisoning, the newspaper accounts of the Whitmore family's deaths, and the documentation of Celia's search for her daughter after the war. But the exhibition also provided crucial context. It displayed slave sale documents, showing how families were deliberately separated for profit. It included advertisements for runaway enslaved people with descriptions of brutal punishments. It presented statistics on the mortality rates of enslaved people, the violence they endured, the complete absence of legal protection, and it included testimony from Celia's descendants, explaining what the photograph meant to them. Not shame, but pride in an ancestor who refused to be powerless, who fought back when the world gave her no other option. The exhibition attracted enormous crowds and generated intense public discussion. Some visitors were disturbed by what they saw as the glorification of murder. Others argued that Celia had been entirely justified, that self-defense and resistance to oppression couldn't be equated with criminal violence. Media coverage was extensive and divided. Conservative commentators criticized the exhibition for promoting violence and rewriting history. Progressive voices praised it for honestly confronting the reality of slavery and the moral complexity of resistance. But the most powerful responses came from black visitors who saw in Celia's smile something resonant and meaningful, an ancestor who had refused to be broken, who had taken power when power was denied to her, who had smiled in the face of her oppressors because she knew they had already lost. One woman, visiting from Atlanta, stood before the photograph for nearly an hour, tears streaming down her face. When a museum volunteer asked if she was okay, she replied, My ancestors survived because they were smart and strong and willing to do whatever they had to do. This woman, Celia, she's all of us. She's every black person who has had to smile while planning how to survive, how to fight back, how to protect what we love. That smile isn't cruelty. It's resistance. It's survival. It's power. Lauren, standing nearby, felt the weight of responsibility. They had brought Celia's story to light. They had made visible what had been deliberately hidden, and now the world had to reckon with what that story meant. The exhibition's success brought both acclaim and controversy. Within academic circles, debates raged about how to teach and contextualize Celia's story. Some historians praised Lauren and Raymond for expanding the historical narrative beyond sanitized accounts of passive resistance. Others argued they were romanticizing violence and providing justification for criminal acts. The controversy intensified when the American Historical Association invited Lauren to present her research at their annual conference. Her presentation, titled Resistance, Violence, and Agency in the Antebellum South, Re-examining Celia's Story, drew an overflow crowd. Lauren began with a photograph, projecting Celia's smile large on the screen behind her. This is what power looks like when you have no power. This is what resistance looks like when resistance is criminalized. This is what justice looks like when the law denies you justice. She walked the audience through the research, the poisoning evidence, the separation of mother and daughter, the failure of authorities to investigate, Celia's survival and reunification with Ruth after the war. And then she addressed the central controversy. Some have asked whether we should celebrate Celia's actions, whether telling this story encourages violence, whether we're abandoning moral judgment in favor of political correctness. Lauren paused, choosing her words carefully. I would argue that we're asking the wrong questions. The question isn't whether Celia's violence was morally defensible by our contemporary standards. The question is, what does it mean that she lived in a system so brutal, so dehumanizing, that killing 5 people seemed like her only path to justice? What does it mean that the legal system protected her enslavers and criminalized her very existence as a free person? She clicked to the next slide, showing the slave sale document that had separated Celia from Ruth. This is violence. Legal violence. State-sanctioned violence. Violence that destroyed families, that treated human beings as property, that denied people every basic right. We have no problem documenting this violence in our museums and textbooks. But when we document how enslaved people fought back against this violence, suddenly we're uncomfortable. Suddenly we need to debate whether their resistance was morally acceptable. The question and answer session was heated. A historian from a southern university challenged her, but you're presenting Celia as a hero. 5 people died, including 3 young adults who may not have been personally responsible for enslaving her or selling her daughter. How do we reconcile that with basic human morality? Lauren met his gaze directly. I'm presenting Celia as a human being who made choices in an impossible situation. Were those young adults responsible? They benefited from slavery. They lived in luxury, built on enslaved labor. They enjoyed wealth directly derived from the sale of human beings, including the sale of Celia's daughter. At what point does benefiting from an evil system make you complicit in that system? Another questioner, a black woman from Howard University, spoke. I think we need to stop centering white discomfort in these discussions. For black people, Celia's story isn't controversial. It's familiar. We all have ancestors who had to make impossible choices to survive, to protect their children, to maintain some shred of dignity and power. The question isn't whether Celia's actions make us uncomfortable. The question is, why are we more comfortable with the violence of slavery than with the violence of resistance to slavery? The room erupted in applause from some quarters and murmurs of disagreement from others. The conference had become a referendum on how American history should be taught and remembered. Raymond, watching from the audience, realized that Celia's photograph had become something larger than they had anticipated. It had become a symbol, a focal point for debates about historical memory, racial justice, and the narratives societies tell about themselves. After the conference, Lauren and Raymond received hundreds of emails. Some were supportive, praising them for courageous scholarship. Others were threatening, accusing them of promoting violence and betraying academic objectivity. But the most meaningful messages came from descendants of enslaved people, thanking them for telling a story that had been suppressed for too long. One email from a high school teacher in Alabama read, "My students need to see Celia's photograph. They need to know that their ancestors weren't passive victims. They need to understand that resistance took many forms, including forms that make us uncomfortable. Thank you for showing them that their ancestors fought back." Lauren saved that email. In moments when she doubted whether the controversy was worth it, she would read it again and remember why Celia's story mattered. Because Celia had smiled in that photograph for a reason. She had wanted to be seen, to be remembered, to be understood. And 164 years later, she was finally getting her wish. 6 months after the exhibition opened, the museum organized a public symposium featuring Celia's descendants. Dr. James Porter agreed to speak, along with his cousin Sharon, his sister Dr. Angela Porter Williams, a sociologist, and Sharon's son Marcus, a graduate student in African American studies. The auditorium was packed, over 500 people, with more watching via livestream. Lauren and Raymond sat in the front row, feeling both proud and anxious about what the descendants might say. Dr. Porter spoke first, his voice steady and clear. I want to start by saying something that might surprise people. My family doesn't celebrate what Celia did. We don't throw parties on the anniversary of the Whitmore family's deaths. We don't teach our children that poisoning people is acceptable. But we do honor Celia's courage, her refusal to be broken, and her determination to achieve justice when justice was systematically denied to her. He clicked to a slide showing the 1860 photograph. The smile has been called many things: triumphant, sinister, knowing, defiant. I see something simpler. I see a woman who survived, who endured the unendurable and came out the other side. That smile isn't about cruelty, it's about survival. Sharon spoke next, her passion evident. People want to judge Celia by contemporary moral standards, as if she was living in a society with laws that protected her, with options for legal recourse, with the ability to simply walk away. But she wasn't. She lived in a society that defined her as property. That gave her owners the legal right to beat her, to separate her from her child, to work her to death. When we talk about Celia's violence, we need to talk about it in context. She was responding to a system built on violence. Dr. Porter Williams, the sociologist, provided academic context. There's a body of research on how oppressed people resist oppression. Sometimes that resistance is open and organized. Rebellions, escape, sabotage. Sometimes it's subtle. Work slowdowns, feigned ignorance, cultural preservation. And sometimes it's intimate and targeted, like what Celia did. All of these forms of resistance are rational responses to oppression. They're not pathological or criminal in the usual sense. They're adaptations to impossible circumstances. She showed a slide with statistics. The number of documented slave rebellions, escape attempts, and acts of resistance in the antebellum South. We tend to focus on the large-scale rebellions, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, because they fit a narrative of organized political resistance. But most resistance was smaller scale, more personal, and just as significant. Celia's story represents thousands of similar stories that were never documented, never photographed, never preserved. Finally, Marcus spoke. At 26, he was the youngest member of the family to address the symposium. I'm a graduate student studying black resistance movements. When I tell people my research interest, they usually assume I'm studying the civil rights movement or maybe earlier political movements. They're surprised when I say I'm studying how enslaved people resisted on a daily basis, the small acts of defiance that historians have often overlooked or minimized. He pointed to Celia's photograph. This is my inspiration. My great-great-great-great-grandmother, who smiled at a camera because she knew she had taken power back from people who tried to make her powerless. That smile is resistance, it's documentation, it's testimony, and it's a reminder that our ancestors were not victims waiting to be saved. They were agents of their own liberation, using whatever tools they had available. The audience's questions were thoughtful and respectful. One person asked whether the family had concerns about how Celia's story might be misused, whether it could be used to justify violence in contemporary contexts. Dr. Porter answered carefully, "Of course we're concerned about misinterpretation, but we can't let that concern silence Celia's story. The reality is that enslaved people had no peaceful legal path to freedom. The system was designed to make them powerless. When we refuse to acknowledge how they fought back, including through violence, we're erasing their agency and their humanity. We're reducing them to passive victims instead of recognizing them as people who made active choices in pursuit of freedom and justice." Sharon added, "And frankly, I'm tired of black people's resistance being held to standards that white people's resistance never is. The American Revolution was violent. The Founding Fathers committed treason and killed British soldiers. But we call them heroes, not murderers. John Brown used violence to fight slavery, and while some people condemned him, many consider him heroic. So why is Celia's violence, used in direct self-defense and in response to the most profound injustice, why is that the violence we question?" After the symposium, dozens of people lined up to meet the family, to thank them, to share their own stories of ancestors who had resisted slavery in various ways. Many were in tears. Some brought photographs of their own ancestors, formerly enslaved people whose stories had been lost or suppressed. Lauren watched from the side of the auditorium, overwhelmed by the response. This was what Celia's photograph had created. Not just a historical controversy, but a space for people to reclaim their ancestors' agency, to honor their resistance, to acknowledge the complexity of survival under oppression. That night, Dr. Porter approached Lauren and Raymond. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing Celia, for taking the time to understand her story, for giving her back her voice." Lauren felt tears on her cheeks. She made sure to be seen. That smile, she was telling us to look, to pay attention, to understand. We just finally listened. The controversy around Celia's story reached a new level when several school districts attempted to include the photograph and accompanying materials in their high school history curricula. The pushback was immediate and fierce. In South Carolina, where the original photograph had been taken, a proposed curriculum that included Celia's story sparked protests from parents' groups. They argued that teaching students about an enslaved woman who poisoned a white family was inappropriate, potentially traumatizing, and promoted violence. The state education board held a public hearing. Lauren was invited to testify, along with several educators, historians, and community members. The opponents spoke first. A parent from Charleston argued, "This is teaching our children that murder is acceptable if you feel oppressed. What kind of message does that send? How can we expect students to respect law and order if we're glorifying someone who killed 5 people?" A school board member added, "I'm concerned about the racial implications. This story could increase racial tensions, make white students feel blamed for slavery, make black students angry. Why can't we stick to teaching the facts of history without these controversial, divisive stories?" When Lauren's turn came, she approached the microphone calmly. "I've been listening to these concerns, and I noticed something interesting. Nobody questions teaching students about the violence of slavery itself. Nobody worries that learning about families being separated, about people being whipped and branded and worked to death, might traumatize students or make them angry. We're comfortable teaching the violence that white people inflicted on black people, but we're deeply uncomfortable teaching how black people resisted that violence." She displayed the photograph on the hearing room screens. "This is Celia. She was enslaved. Her daughter was sold away from her, stolen essentially for profit. When she tried to run away to find her child, she was recaptured. She lived under a system where she had no legal rights, no protection, no path to justice through legitimate channels, and she made a choice. A desperate choice. A choice born of profound oppression." Lauren's voice grew stronger. "If we teach students about slavery but refuse to teach them about resistance to slavery, we're lying to them. We're presenting enslaved people as passive victims instead of as human beings who fought for their freedom in whatever ways they could. That's not just bad history, it's dehumanizing." A black educator from Columbia spoke next. "I teach at a predominantly black high school. My students need to see Celia's photograph. They need to know that their ancestors weren't helpless. They need to understand that resistance took many forms, some comfortable for us to discuss, some not. When we sanitize history, when we only teach the resistance that makes white people comfortable, we're stealing our students' heritage." The debate continued for hours. Finally, the school board voted. The material about